My brother made my life hell as kids, and as adults, he slept with my wife, and my son wasn't mine. But now he comes crawling back after being disinherited. I have a younger brother, Caleb, who has always despised me. If you're wondering if it was out of jealousy, you'd be wrong. He wasn't the unfavored child I was. He was the golden boy, so there was no reason for him to feel jealous. Let me give you some context. My mom always spoiled my younger brother. He was the golden child in our family. Mom would cook his meals, make his clothes, and even ask me to help him with his schoolwork. It was expected of me because family helps family, but I never received the same courtesy. I accepted it because I was pretty independent. Maybe it was partly my fault for indulging his needs and desires without expecting reciprocity. He never lent me a hand when I needed it, and only approached me when he wanted something. I was a quiet, introverted kid who liked studying and keeping to myself, while he was exactly like our dad, rough and loud. I also tend to be straightforward and honest, not sugarcoating things and saying them as they are. I think my mom may have developed a negative perception of me because of this. As a result, he was everyone's favorite in our family, though I didn't care much about that while we were growing up. Problems arose when he found ways to bully or mock me for being different from him. He'd make fun of my height or the fact that I wore glasses. He'd sneak into my room and try to read my diary, then tattle to my mom about whatever he found written there. I'd yell at him and complain to my parents about how he invaded my privacy, but they brushed it off, saying it wasn't a big deal. He did worse things, like nearly breaking my glasses and putting gross stuff in my food. Once, he even put pebbles in my cereal, but luckily, I noticed before they could damage my teeth. I told my mom, but she dismissed it, saying, "That's just how brothers bond." Whenever we fought, Caleb insulted me, deliberately targeting all my insecurities. He and I went to the same school, so he knew I was being bullied by a couple of kids. Instead of standing up for me, he sided with them. He'd join in calling me names like ugly loser or hairy monkey, and encourage the bullies to hurt me physically because, according to him, I was just a big failure. One time we fought over something trivial, I don't even remember what, but at the end of the fight, he told me to kill myself. I could brush off other insults easily, but that one really hurt because I was struggling with mental health issues at the time. I'm better now, but it was devastating to hear my own brother say he wanted me dead. Since Dad was often at work and Mom didn't seem to care much, she even scolded me once, saying it was my fault for teasing and irritating him. Things progressively got worse. Once, Caleb tried to set my hair on fire when we were in high school, and shockingly, Mom sided with him, insisting he was just playing around. Who plays like that, seriously? Thankfully, Dad finally took my side and pointed out that they had some serious problems. He threatened to call the police on Caleb. This was an eye-opening moment for my brother because, until then, he had never been reprimanded for any of his actions. He was genuinely shocked, and Dad went on to tell him that enough was enough and that he needed to start respecting his older brother. Afterward, Dad came into my room and talked to me. I never expected Dad to take my side because he always told Caleb how similar they were while growing up, which was true. Dad told me he had patiently waited for years for Caleb to grow up, thinking maybe he was just an immature kid. But he was starting to realize Caleb was becoming a huge bully. When I heard Dad say this, I felt so validated I almost cried. I confessed everything Caleb had done to me over the years, and even talked about the bullying at school. Dad was shocked to learn everything that had been going on. The next day, he went to talk to the school principal, ensuring my bullies were warned of severe consequences if they continued. Later that evening, Dad signed me up for MMA classes at our local gym. He told me I needed to grow up and face the bullies in my life. I'll admit, a nerdy kid like me trying to learn how to fight must have been laughable to see. However, as with everything in my life, I was very focused when I wanted to learn something. I balanced my studies to work out every day and attend MMA classes. Not to brag, but it completely changed my life and my physique. One day, Caleb was back to his antics. He had stolen my pocket money, which we used to get for helping our parents with chores. I'd been saving my money for a long time. Caleb had snuck into my room and taken it. I caught him just as he was about to head out on his bike with his friends. I firmly told him to give me back my money because I knew stealing was wrong. But Caleb laughed and said the only thing I could do was run to Dad for help. I don't know what came over me, but I gave Caleb a strong punch to the face. He was stunned silent as he fell backward to the ground. I picked him up, took my money out of his pants pocket, and threw him back to the ground. Caleb started bawling loudly like a baby. It was comical to see a teenager crying on the ground. However, my mom came rushing out of the house, hearing her baby crying, to help him up and find out what had happened. When she found out I had fought with him, she was shocked and immediately began scolding me. She said that, as the older brother, I should be setting a better example for Caleb. While Caleb seemed to enjoy seeing me get reprimanded, Mom also complained to Dad about how I had hit Caleb and needed to be controlled. Dad, however, took a different approach. He calmly asked both of us to explain our sides of the story. I told him how Caleb had stolen the money I had worked hard to save. Caleb, on the other hand, tried to justify his actions, saying he needed the money for a date and that, as his brother, I should help him out. But Dad wasn't having any of it. He told Caleb that he was lucky I had only hit him for stealing because anyone else would have called the police. Dad continued, telling Caleb he had no right to take other people's belongings without permission. Caleb didn't like this one bit and began throwing a tantrum, probably hoping Mom would step in to defend him. But Dad stood his ground. When Caleb realized he wasn't going to get me punished, he screamed that he hated me and stormed off to his room, slamming the door shut. From that incident onward, Caleb kept his distance from me. He finally realized he could no longer bully me, especially since Dad didn't support his behavior anymore. For the first time in a long while, I felt like we were equals. While Caleb couldn't physically hurt me anymore, he still made nasty comments when our parents weren't around. It only got worse as we grew older. Every year, it seemed like he became angrier and had an even shorter fuse. If I approached him to ask something, he'd ignore me to my face, walk out of the room, and mutter insults like "loser nerd" under his breath. If he needed something from me, he wouldn't even talk to me directly. Instead, he'd ask Mom to pass along the message. When I questioned Mom about why Caleb couldn't just talk to me if he wanted something, she'd plead with me to be more understanding. I had no idea if this was just temporary while he was going through puberty and I had to wait for it to pass, or if he really hated me. I used to be able to handle the things he said over the years, but there came a point where I just wanted to move out of the house to get away from him. I went to my mother countless times, asking her to have a conversation with all of us to talk it out, but she always refused, saying she didn't want to get involved. I even asked her opinion about why he treated me that way, but she simply deflected the question. Eventually, I went to my dream university since I was a very good student and even qualified for a scholarship. My dad threw a party for me, and my mom also seemed proud of me. However, Caleb remained distant and barely acknowledged my accomplishments. The day I left for college was a mix of excitement for the future and relief to escape the toxic environment at home. The first months at university were liberating. I made new friends, enjoyed my classes, and began building a life separate from the oppressive atmosphere I had experienced in my childhood. The constant fear of Caleb's verbal attacks lifted, and I felt a new sense of peace. I started dating my wife Karen when we were both in our second year of college. A friend introduced us at a fraternity party, and we immediately hit it off. Coming from a religious family, having children out of wedlock was completely unacceptable. However, we found out she was pregnant during our senior year of college, which led us to get married as soon as we graduated. Our wedding was a small but peaceful ceremony. Our parents were happy for us, and we had a great time at our wedding. At that time, I believed she was the love of my life. I always held the mindset that I wanted monogamy in life, a woman to come home to and be with for the long term. Even though women tried to get involved with me over the years, I never pursued anything because I was truly happy in my marriage. Karen was my ideal girl, and I never wanted to hurt her. However, over the years, there were 2 occasions where I discovered she was being unfaithful in our marriage. One was an on and off affair that lasted a few years with her married coworker, and the other was a fling with an ex-boyfriend she had dated in high school when she visited her family in another state. I'm sure there will be people who might call me a fool, and looking back, I really can't deny it myself. After a period of separation in both situations, I made the decision to forgive my wife. I never wanted to raise my child in a broken home, and I sincerely believed we could overcome these challenges. We were quite young when the situation with her coworker happened, so I chalked it up to youthful mistakes and not thinking things through. For a while, things seemed fine between us. I could never fully trust her, but I did my best to push aside my doubts because I knew that if I chose to forgive her, I had to work to move past it and start anew. It's been 4 years since the second time she was unfaithful, and I felt I made the right decision to give her the chance to prove she still wanted to be in our marriage. For years, Karen seemed to have changed, and we were genuinely happy with the plans we had in place for our family's future. However, 3 months ago, my reality was once again shattered by another incident, which in my mind was far worse than the others. When she revealed that she had been sleeping with someone for quite some time and suggested that our son might not even be mine. Hearing her words, I felt as though the ground had opened up beneath me. A mix of shock, betrayal, and disbelief overwhelmed me. I struggled to comprehend the enormity of what she had just revealed. Stunned, I managed to ask her why she had kept such a significant secret and how she could do something so devastating. Her reaction was cold and indifferent. She seemed distant, almost uncaring about the pain she had caused. Her answers were vague, leaving me with more questions than answers. It was a surreal and painful moment, facing shattered trust and uncertainties about my own family. I kept asking Karen to tell me the truth because I felt I deserved to know who the child's father was, as I had literally been raising him from the start. In the end, she admitted it was Caleb. My eyes widened in shock as I asked her what exactly she meant by that. That's when Karen told me how she and Caleb had become friends when I introduced her to my family, and she had been with us from Thanksgiving through New Year's. I remember Caleb, who was generally distant from me, being quite polite and warm to her. I was glad because I didn't want Karen to feel uncomfortable. She wanted to be accepted into my family, so she spent a lot of time with my mom whenever she could. She noticed that Caleb and I weren't very close and asked me about it. Eventually, I told her about my childhood relationship with Caleb and how we could probably never repair our relationship since he could never get over his feelings. Karen understood, but she started including Caleb whenever we went out, perhaps hoping that we would grow closer to each other. If we went to see a movie, she invited Caleb, and then we had to watch the movie Caleb wanted to see. I suppose during this time, Caleb and I exchanged some words here and there, which was a significant improvement compared to how he had been ignoring me for years. I remember Karen and Caleb used to hang out and play video games together, but I never thought much of it. Karen told me how one day Caleb opened up to her about his struggles and his recent breakup with his then ex-girlfriend. He seemed so vulnerable with her, and they struck up a friendship. She said how sometimes he flirted harmlessly with her when I wasn't around, and apparently one thing led to another, and she couldn't control herself anymore. I closed my eyes as the vision of my wife and brother sleeping together nearly made me vomit. She told me how guilty she felt afterward and ran away from him. After that, she decided to return home, which was true because my girlfriend suddenly told me she wanted to go back home when I thought she would spend New Year's with me. I tried to convince her to stay, but she was determined to leave after the holidays. When we met at university, once classes resumed, she was back to being her usual cheerful self, so I never questioned anything. 2 weeks later, we found out she was pregnant. Now, Karen told me she had no idea if the child was really mine or Caleb's, and had no way to prove it because I was already taking responsibility. She knew that between the two of us, I was the more reliable brother, so she decided to stay with me, and that's why we got married. I felt like my whole world was crumbling around me. The son I had loved and spent countless hours with might not even be mine. I asked her if she had been sleeping with Caleb in recent times, and she nodded slowly. Karen told me how she and Caleb had always stayed in touch because their chemistry was undeniable. They would sneak away to hotels when she lied to me about working overtime. She told me how half of her business trips were just romantic getaways with him. I asked Karen why she would even stay married to me if she truly wanted my brother, but Karen told me how she didn't want to be the one to end a marriage. And seeing what a wonderful father I was to our son, she had stayed with me all this time. In her words, she had made a mistake and didn't know when to stop. I simply told Karen that I was glad she told me the truth and that I was going to pack and move out. Karen began crying and begging me for forgiveness, telling me how I was supposed to yell at her and scold her, but here I was, calmly thinking about my next move. I stayed silent as I walked to my closet and started packing some of my clothes into my suitcase. Karen kept saying that if I truly loved her, then I should at least try to fight for her and that mistakes happen in all marriages. When she realized I wasn't going to do anything, she changed her tactic and told me how my son would be affected if we divorced and how children shouldn't grow up in a broken home. I reminded her that I might not even be the father, which reduced her to tears, and she started yelling at me for being cruel and how I could so easily walk away when I had been there for the child since birth. It seemed my wife believed there was nothing that could make me want to leave our marriage. I suppose that was partly my fault for letting so many things slide in the past. Even though I still felt some love for her, it seemed to stem more from the belief that we had a child together and had been together since college. Karen kept insisting it wasn't too late and that we could fix things, but I found it hard to believe her and felt like I no longer had the patience to deal with her. Trust was a significant issue for me, and her words felt hollow. Even if I forgave her, I could never forget that she had slept with my own brother. I've always believed people can make mistakes and be forgiven because no one is perfect, but this crossed a line. I left her crying at the doorstep and checked into a hotel. The next day, I went straight to my parents and told them everything about my wife's affair with Caleb and how they had been sleeping together for years behind my back. The shock on their faces was evident. My mother, true to her nature, initially tried to defend Caleb, saying this couldn't be true because her son would never do something like that to his own brother. Determined to expose the truth, I asked my parents to stay silent and allow me to call Caleb right in front of them. I told them not to make any noise so I could reveal Caleb's true colors. I wanted him to think it was just a private conversation between us, so he would let his guard down. When Caleb answered, I confronted him with the revelation of his affair with my wife. Initially, he vehemently denied it and refused to admit anything. Then, when I told him Karen had confessed everything, he started blaming Karen, labeling her as unprincipled. He told me it wasn't his fault if women were drawn to him and that he was the better-looking brother. I firmly told him I was going to expose him to everyone, When Caleb mockingly said no one would believe me and that he was the favorite son anyway, I smirked at his arrogance and thanked him for confirming the truth. Since our parents had heard everything, Caleb fell silent and then stammered to explain himself, tripping over his words in an attempt to save face. My mother, still struggling with the shock, demanded an explanation from Caleb. He stammered through a weak attempt to justify his actions, blaming everyone but himself and desperately trying to pin the fault on Karen. I could see my mother, who had once protected her favorite son, now feeling a mix of disappointment and anger. In that charged moment, I felt a strange sense of vindication. For years, I had endured Caleb's torment. Now, the truth was out, and the roles were reversed. It was Caleb who stood exposed, his actions laid bare for all to see. As Caleb's words failed him, my father, usually reserved in his expressions, couldn't contain his disappointment. He asked me to hand over the phone and launched into a reprimand. "Caleb," he began, "what you've done isn't just a betrayal of your brother, but a betrayal of this family. You slept with your brother's wife and continued even after they were married. Your actions have consequences, and they've irreparably damaged the trust we had in you. I raised both of you to value family loyalty and decency. What you've shown today goes against everything I tried to instill in you." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink into Caleb's conscience. "The disregard you've shown for your brother's feelings, the disrespect for the sanctity of his marriage, is unacceptable. You haven't just hurt him, you've tainted the bonds that hold us together as a family. I feel your mother and I are to blame for what you've become now, and we will no longer enable this behavior. From today, I'm cutting off the college fund I had set up for you. You can figure out your tuition fees on your own." Seeing my dad punish Caleb was the ultimate vindication. I had exposed his true nature, and it was clear he had underestimated the consequences. My mother, persistent in her protests, continued justifying him, but my father quickly ended the call, cutting off Caleb's attempts to explain his actions. My mother approached me and hugged me. It had been a long time since we shared such a moment, but in that embrace, there was an unspoken understanding and support amidst the family turmoil. She apologized for not believing me all this time. I felt like my 14-year-old self would never have imagined this moment, being vindicated and embraced by my mother. After that, my dad helped me find a good lawyer so I could divorce Karen. She and her lawyer tried to play dirty by demanding alimony since I earned more than her, but thankfully, her affair played heavily in my favor. We also conducted a paternity test for my son, which confirmed that Caleb was the father. I can't begin to describe how painful it was to digest this news. It was worse than when Karen told me she'd been cheating. I felt so upset that my son wasn't mine. However, I suppose God works in mysterious ways because I decided to stay strong despite all this. Karen begged me to continue visiting my son since he shouldn't be punished for everything, but I simply couldn't bear to see him. He reminded me of Caleb and I hated him. After my divorce was finalized and I was finally free, I moved into my own bachelor apartment. It felt surreal to live alone since I'd married so young and had never truly lived by myself. However, as I'd always been independent, I quickly adapted to my single lifestyle, and honestly, I loved it. 2 weeks ago, my dad called to tell me he'd been thinking about changing his will since he didn't want to leave Caleb anything. If there's one thing to know about my dad, it's that he's extremely firm. Once he decided he wanted nothing more to do with Caleb, he stuck to his word. Caleb tried reaching out to our parents and even showed up at their door begging for forgiveness, but they wouldn't even let him in. My mother, who usually gave in to Caleb's tantrums, also seemed to be done with him, though she must be struggling deeply. Throughout all of this, Caleb didn't even text me once to apologize for what he'd done. Clearly, he didn't even regret it. He was just upset about being cut off by our parents. Well, my dad told me he would leave everything to me to ensure Caleb wouldn't protest later. He would leave him just $1. My eyes widened in shock because my dad had worked so hard all his life, including his assets, retirement fund, and life insurance. It totaled nearly $2 million. The only clause in his will was that if my dad passed before my mom, she would continue living in their house, though the property would be in my name. Of course, I didn't mind this, as I wanted to take care of my mom until her last days. I don't know how, but Caleb found out about all this, and since he couldn't communicate with my parents, he called me yesterday, trying to make amends between us. He told me how he'd been struggling to continue with college and how, after Karen discovered the child's paternity, she had been pestering him for child support. He said he had no money and was looking for part-time jobs, but couldn't find anything. He begged me to talk to our family so we could start over, as he really needed my help. I started laughing in his face and told him I was done with him and that he should have thought about all this before sleeping with my wife and getting her pregnant. Caleb began arguing that I was being unfair and that she was guilty too, to which I agreed, reminding him how I divorced her and now she was his responsibility. So he shouldn't call me complaining about her or their child, as these were the consequences of his own actions. Caleb began raising his voice, but I interrupted him, reminding him that he was no longer the favorite son in the family, but the black sheep who had slept with his own brother's wife. Caleb started crying at this point and told me how everyone was against him, including our grandparents and relatives, which was true, but no longer my concern. I told him we were done and to never call me again. Since then, I've been replaying the conversation over and over in my head, and though I feel a bit bad for him, because it's in my nature, I don't want to do anything for him. I don't know what Reddit thinks about all this. Update 1. I want to address some questions that have arisen about my relationship with my son Henry. Some of you have expressed concern and even called me cruel. I understand where those feelings come from. However, I want to be transparent about my reasons for not maintaining contact with Henry. The truth is that I don't feel comfortable raising another man's child. This isn't a stepchild scenario. In this case, I was made to believe he was my son, only to discover that he was, in fact, my brother's son. Of course, I'm hurt, and I've cried about it for days. But the reason I don't want to have contact with Henry is that I no longer want Karen in my life. If I talk to her son, she'll find a way to insert herself back into my life, and I need my own space. You can call me cruel or selfish, but I can't see him again, at least not for a long time. Update 2. Most of you correctly guessed that it was, in fact, my mother who told Caleb about my dad changing his will, and that's why he called me as a last resort to make amends. I confronted her in front of my father, and she broke down. She told me how she'd punished Caleb enough, and that he'd learned his lesson. My father firmly told my mother that if she felt Caleb's actions were forgivable, then he couldn't remain married to her, as he could never forgive him for this betrayal. His threats seemed to silence my mother. My father made it clear that if she ever spoke to Caleb again and we found out, then she could pack her bags and leave. As I mentioned before, my father is a very stubborn man. Hopefully, my mother learns from her mistakes. Update 3. It's been 5 months since my last update. My relationship with my parents has improved significantly over the past few months. My father and I go golfing every weekend, and he acts more like a friend to me than a father. My mother, though she misses Caleb, has stayed away from him. The last I heard about Caleb was from my cousin, who told me how Caleb had been asking everyone for money and ultimately had to drop out of college when he could no longer afford the tuition. He and Karen are living together and raising Henry, which is probably for the best, I guess. I never bring up Caleb in conversations with my parents, and they don't either. For those asking, I'm doing quite well. I got promoted at work 2 months ago, so my salary has significantly improved. I'm not dating anyone yet, as I feel I still need time and space to heal. I've been attending therapy sessions, so we'll see how that goes. Update 4. This update is partly happy and partly sad, but there's a lot to share. First, I've started seeing someone. It's not serious yet, but things are going well. I want to take my time with this relationship, as I don't want to end up with another serial cheater like Karen. So, I'm taking things very slowly to test the waters before committing to anything. On the other hand, my relationship with my parents has continued to improve, even with my mother, who no longer seems sad about Caleb. Sometimes, I've even overheard her making negative comments about him, such as during family gatherings when someone mentions him. Gatherings he's not invited to, thankfully, as the family believes what he did is unforgivable, especially my father's side of the family. Now, I understand where my father's stubbornness comes from, which has turned out to be a good thing in this case. The next thing to share is that I've had contact with Caleb again, and it wasn't good. He called me from an unknown number. When I answered, I was about to hang up, but he almost immediately said he wanted to apologize, so I waited to hear more. He told me he was deeply sorry for everything that happened, though I didn't believe a word of it. Then, when he finished his pity party, he got to the real reason he called. Though he didn't say it outright, it felt like the apology was just a prelude to asking for something. He said that being cut off from the family had been really hard for him and Karen, and that even Karen missed seeing my parents. Which is funny, because my father has said a few times during our golf games that Karen is a 304. I don't know where my father picked up that term, but I find it hilarious that he knows it. Even my mother, back when she still somewhat supported Caleb, blamed Karen for all this. So, I don't think they'll be welcoming her back with open arms. I told Caleb I didn't care because there was no need for forgiveness. Forgiveness is reserved for people you care about, and Caleb isn't someone I care about right now. That made him angry, but I eventually hung up and went on with my day. I needed to finish work quickly because I was planning to play a few holes later with my dad. But my update regarding Caleb doesn't end there because he decided to show up a few days later at my workplace. He waited for me in the parking lot, standing in front of my car, which I guess he found out about through some relative or something. He started the same way as the phone call, with an apology. But this time, I stopped him cold before he could continue. He didn't like that and got aggressive, spewing the usual nonsense about how I was the nerd and he was the handsome one, etc. But when he got too close and started pushing me, I punched him square in the face, just like when he stole my money when we were kids. But this time, it was loaded with all the anger I'd built up over what happened. Thankfully, coworkers witnessed the incident, so I have witnesses if he tries anything in court. Plus, I have image detecting cameras at home because, at the end of the day, I'm a tech geek, so if he tries anything there, I'll have evidence as well. And if he attacks me again, I'll get to defend myself physically for free, so it's not in his best interest to push it further. It's a shame things have reached this point, but at least my life is improving now.